RosterMania is well on its way ahead of the Black Ops 4 season. EU's own Splyce has already made roster changes after a disappointing finish at Champs. Of course, to talk on these specific changes and more, I've got Call of Duty World League commentator and analyst, Chris, a.k.a. Tunn. What's going on today, buddy?
I'm good. You called me an analyst and it took me back.
It's true.
Surprise.
You are an analyst. Whether you believe it or not, you've been on the analyst desk.
Yeah,
exactly. It counts. I think it's fair to say.
Loose word of analyst there, but no, I'm good. Thank you, Landon. I'm good.
Well, good, man. Okay, so today we're going to be talking about Splyce, obviously, the first team to really initiate RosterMania. Despite all the talks on 100 Thieves, all the talks on other organizations, Splyce was really one of the first major organizations to make this change. So I want to kind of give an evolution on what has happened with Splyce throughout the year, your thoughts on it, and kind of go from there. But coming into the year, I think it's fair to say Splyce was looked upon as a top-level EU squad, adding longtime vet Tommy in place of Zero, which sparked quite a bit of controversy over whether or not that was the right pickup. However, in spite of it, they came out at CWL Dallas and finished second, actually, just behind Team Caliber. And after that event, I was looking at it. I think a lot of the community was looking at it and saying, wow, like Tommy might actually be like the best EU player in the world, at least as of right now. Of course, over time after Dallas, Splyce kind of started to go on a decline from top 12, top 16, a decent finish at Birmingham, and then a top 20 placing at Seattle, which became the breaking point. Now, regarding that change that was made and what would later be the lineup, seeing Joshh brought in place of Tommy, what did you make of the change back when it was originally made? Did you have high hopes for Splyce at that time? And at least in my opinion, I was like, maybe Tommy, like at least based off stats and whatnot, a lot of the community was kind of hesitant and being like, well, I don't think Tommy's the right guy to go. What were your thoughts in that case?
My thoughts were that obviously, like as you said, from a stats point of view, Tommy was definitely not the guy to go. And you know that sort of came to fruition when we seen how well he played outside that team as well. But I'm sure we'll come to that. But yeah, for me, it was never about talent with Tom. It always seemed to be there was a clash in the team. It seemed to be that. I mean, I've heard from multiple different people, and you know, I love Tom, but it sounds like it's quite difficult to work with if you have somebody else in your team who wants to sort of take the reins and put in some put in some leadership, then Tommy tends to be hard to team with because he's one of the guys he wants to take control of the team, which is why we've probably seen him excel with teams like his original Fnatic roster. So you had the Scraps and Wuskins on there and Sunny B. So these guys who are coming up and are willing to learn, you've had those sort of guys on it. We've seen it happen again with his Vitality squad. He's brought up 3 youngsters and the team's done pretty well. He seems to work in those scenarios, but when you put him together with teams with other players in there who want to take control and not have an ego, but you know, have these teams who've got players with experience on them, that sort of thing, then it makes it a bit more difficult because he wants to be in charge. That's the vibe you get. That's what I hear. So from my standpoint, definitely wasn't because of how good he is. We all know how good Tommy can be. Was definitely just due to him having conflicts inside the team. Bringing Joshh in, though, obviously wasn't Splyce's first pick. We all know who the big free agent, well, not free agent, who the big guy was that everybody wanted. And unfortunately for Splyce, Scraps chose Red Reserve, and then they unfortunately ended up with Joshh. And I don't think that would have been their first pick. Joshh performed all right when he got into the team, but obviously I think if they got Scraps, it would have been a different story.
Yeah, I was actually going to translate into as well. Like after I heard about the change, of course, coming through whenever Red Reserve got Scraps, which was a huge pickup, I was thinking, okay, well, Splyce, what are they going to do to compete with this? Like what is their options here now that Scraps has gone with essentially the rival in some cases? What are they going to do? And I feel like that obviously went for the guy who happened to get replaced by Scraps. It was kind of just like an odd scenario for me because I know there was a lot of bids put in for Scraps in, you know, many different organizations are kind of throwing their opinions out there, throwing maybe even some cash out there as well. But whenever when everyone realized that Scraps was out of the picture, I guess I was under the impression that Joshh was just a simple pickup for Splyce. And I don't know, it just felt like odd to me. It was like Red Reserve is making plays, which, you know, granted, the cash was there, the money was there, the players were there. But I felt like in some ways, Splyce was just like, okay, who do we go for? Joshh kind of falls into our lap, and here we go. Like there was never really a deciding factor as to like, okay, let's try to bring in a few different players. I know there were guys who were kind of rumored that could be going to Splyce instead, but I just felt like Joshh kind of fell into their lap, and they just kind of rolled with it.
It was the safe pickup, wasn't it? That was the thing. It's one of those things where you know Joshh is a pretty consistent player. All right, okay, not going to be one of these guys who puts up with the Slayers sort of thing. He's not going to put up the same numbers that Scraps would. Obviously, we've seen that he didn't. But he's not that sort of player. But as you said, like he's a safe player for them. They've played with him before. They all know him. They've all been in a team with him at some point. You know what you're going to get with Joshh. It's consistency typically, but maybe not shining out as one of the more brilliant players within the European scene. You know, he's still very much in the top 8, top 12 players in Europe, but still, it was a safe pick for me. I mean, you look at what happened with the Unilad team. I mean, there was Alex and Zed in there. Obviously,
very true. Yeah.
Yeah, Alex was picked up before this. I think they dropped Moose for Alex, if I'm right, and then Zed came in. As far as I'm aware, I presume Zed was probably in the equation for them. And then you look back and you think, well, he's played pretty well with Unilad. And it's just been a case of, I feel like they went safe with Joshh and it didn't pay off in the end. It's just, I'm sure we'll talk further on how the season went.
Well, yeah, exactly. I mean, as far as Splyce's future was considered after the pickup, after the roster move, the changes still, or the issues were still pretty much there. CDL Anaheim, they ended up having a top 12 placement, finishing second in groups, but lost to Rise Nation in winners bracket, and then later fell to Game 5 to Mind Freak. As far as the Stage 2 regular season, they ended up finishing top 14, a 5-9 record, nothing really outstanding by any means. Obviously, that was in Division A and didn't qualify for playoffs heading into champs. Of course, like I said, speaking of that, Tunn, what were the expectations like, in your opinion, of course, for the Splyce roster in their pool? Considering they had Team Sween, E United, and EZG, I should say, did you have them making it out?
Yeah, I did. I think nobody really expected Team Sween to be as good as they were, but I think that sort of, let's be honest, champs didn't go as planned on any aspect. So I think that, yeah, Splyce would have expected to get out probably second behind E United. That's where I had them in my predictions. As far as the tournament as a whole would have went, I mean, on a normal playing field, not the champs playing field that we had where it was just crazy results, I would have said probably a top 12, top 16, maybe won one game and then went from there. I think it's difficult though, because I don't think we ever seen this team be as good as we potentially thought they could have been, or we seen them be at the very beginning of the year. So we seen them have a good performance in Dallas. Yeah, okay, they got a second at Birmingham as well, but you might want to factor the crowd into that one as well. But I don't want to take anything away from them, because at the end of the day, they did play well at that event. But inconsistency was a big thing for them throughout the year, and I mean, it was inconsistency through the groups as well. I mean, they should be beating teams like Team Sween, but the thing is with that matchup is that, again, it's that typical thing where these AM teams come through and they're going up against pro teams who they can watch countless hours of VOD on, and it makes it very difficult for the pro team when they don't know what this other team is going to do. So that could be a factor in the reason that they lost, but realistically, I expected them to finish second in their pool and seeing what happens at Nationwide, but never got that far, unfortunately.
Yeah, like I think in some instances, like Team Sween was a little bit slept on, like coming into the tournament, just based off their history as a lineup. But at the same time, I'm really glad that you brought that up. The factor of like, hey, this is a new roster. Nobody really knows what they're going to do. They've had plenty of time to study up on the United, plenty of time to study up on Splyce as well, and that obviously really shined through. Maybe not to what like the skill ceiling that we thought they would have, but still, it was unreal to see what Team Sween obviously did, and it didn't equal out for a positive result for Splyce in the end. But regarding some number crunching, I actually wanted to look through Splyce's overall run throughout the last three events that they were at, which was CW Anaheim, Stage 2 in general, and Champs 2018. And regarding some issues with the other two players, Jared and Bance, who are still on this team as of right now, I noticed a little bit of an issue with them when it came down to certain game modes. It wasn't necessarily always Joshh, always MadCat in a lot of these instances. And these are just a few numbers, just a few stats I want to throw out there. CW Anaheim, Splyce ended up having a 2-7 search and destroy record, in which case Bance actually had the lowest KD on the team with a 0.78. They also finished off 2-4 in CTF at that event. Bance also had the lowest KD at a 0.83. In Stage 2, one of their kind of struggling game modes at times was CTF. They ended up having an 8-6 record in that. Bance finished off with the lowest KD at a 0.88. And at Champs, the biggest one of them all, right? Search and Destroy, they finished off 2-1. However, Jared actually happened to be the lowest at a 0.79. And then in CTF, they ended up finishing 1-2. And who's there? It's Bance at the lowest KD with a 0.54. Now, like I said, those are just a handful of stats. But with MadCat and Joshh no longer in the picture here, Tunn, is there a team that you think either of them could work with? A team that maybe could fit well with MadCat and or Joshh right now?
I think it's difficult until we know what's happening with the season. I think that's when people are going to start making moves. For me, I feel like MadCat was probably the most consistent performer throughout the year outside of, well, obviously, I can't really base how Tommy did across the year because he was only there for 6 months. So, well, a few months. But I would say MadCat was probably the most consistent performer. Bance probably the most consistently poorest performer. I don't want to bash Bance too much because I think he's just, it's one of them things where players have maybe a poor year. We've seen him have fantastic last 2 years, last year especially. But then realistically, he just hasn't performed to the levels of Ben bans that we sort of expect. I think for me to see where they're going to go, I think we need to see some of European players stop. They all sit in this bubble of players that all play together all the time. I think we need to see some branching out. I think we're going to see some youngsters get a chance, because we've seen it work this year already with Unilad. Alex got a shot. Turns out he's one of the best SMGs in the game.
That was a delightful surprise, I'm sure.
Yeah, it was a very nice surprise actually watching them. But then you got people like coming up through the ranks, like people like Dylan Card, players like this, who, I mean, they've just come into the age where they can play at the professional level as well. I think we'll see teams trying to pick up some youngsters and maybe not forming around the same 24 players that we always seem to see. I mean, that's what Team Sweden have sort of came from. They were the PT Quicker, all those guys have teamed in and around with all these top players for the past 3 or 4 years, and they formed a team together, and it worked out for them in the end. But we never really see too many youngsters being picked up by this group of players who typically tend to play together. So I want to see potentially a branch out in that respect. Obviously, we've heard rumors about international teams now, stemming from a couple of things that pros have said publicly. Happily, I'm not going to get in trouble for that one. And that could definitely be some potential. That obviously makes teams a lot more of a variation. Like, we can definitely see some international teams. We could potentially see players like that do that. So it'll be interesting to see. But as I said, I want to see something fresh. I don't want to see the same 4 players together time and time again. Try something new.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's really important to mention too, especially when it comes into the European scene. I feel like your sentiments there really echo what the entire European community wants, which is something new, a different change, at least some type of difference when it comes into rosters from year to year. And I'm going to know, in your opinion too, for Black Ops 4, I know you kind of hit on it a little bit, but do you think we'll start to see organizations, especially from Europe, maybe start to kind of look toward maybe the academy route? United right now are kind of heading into World War II. They were obviously had a certain roster that pick up some young guns, and that's the team who kind of practices with their regular roster and search and destroy. You got some really notable names who are probably on the come up within the next year or two. You think we could see, some European teams maybe start to form some academy lineups? And like you mentioned on the international front, I mean, I've heard, quite a bit of talk, like you said, along with the factor of maybe trying to have some international rosters. Do you think that would really be a good thing for the European scene and really kind of expand heading into Black Ops 4 to help Europe kind of be that main front again?
I think as far as the academy side of the question, I think that is one of those things that the teams potentially do, but I'd rather see maybe teams who are lower on the scale of organizations. So what your Brashes, teams like that who came into Europe, your Vitalities, pick up a young team, or pick up like they did with Tommy picking up 3 youngsters, that sort of thing, rather than like a Splyce or a Red Reserve going in to then pick up teams who could potentially do something. I mean, Splyce are an American organization anyway, but they've always typically been a European team, so to speak. So yeah, that potentially could happen. What was the second half of the question? I totally forgot that.
Oh no, it was just about like the international talent. Do you think that would really kind of liven up things?
Yeah. I think to be honest, when it comes down to this, I think that teams. So yes, Splyce, Red Reserve, Unilad always sort of be seen as European organizations, even though, as I said, Splyce are technically an American organization. I think if they are bringing American players in, I don't think they're going to lose their identity as a European team, so to speak. I think that should still stay, and if it does, I think it is going to be good for the European scene, especially in terms of fan base. I mean, what's to say if Splyce keep a hold of Jordan Bance and then go and get 2 superstars from America and see what happens with this team, you know what I mean? That it's still going to be supported as a European team. I would hope that all the supporters sort of stay with that. Red Reserve, personally, I know we're not talking about them, but I don't see them changing, so I don't think that's going to be too much of a factor with them. But I think, yeah, international players would definitely be a good thing, I think. Saying that though, I hope that people would still support the team because of the European team, but then people might move away and say, oh well, it's not a European team anymore, I'm just going to support the actual fully European roster. But whether we see too many full European rosters anymore, I don't know if we're going to see it as much.
Yeah. I think it'd be interesting to at least just dive into it. Maybe even have one roster kind of be like the guinea pig and just see how it works out. I mean, granted, I know on the topic of having that EU pride definitely is existent, but I think in some instances as well, like organizations might have to realize, like in Splyce's case, for example, hey, we have a European-based Call of Duty team. However, we are, North American-based. Maybe having that international flavor, teams would maybe want to support the organization rather than the region itself. But I definitely agree. I think it would be interesting to see at the very least. But of course, on the topic of roster moves, There's a ton of speculation on whether or not Black Ops 4, of course, is going to be played on 5v5 or on 4v4 as per typical. Regardless of with all the rumors, do you think teams should maybe slow down and wait for these to be announced, maybe try to wait out the waters a little bit, or are they going to get behind? Like, I think that's the big issue with a lot of teams. It's like, hey, we want to make these changes. We don't know how many players are going to be on the team, but we don't want to be left on the back burner. We don't want to be starting off Black Ops 4 season with, essentially in last place.
I mean, what is it? The 19th of September, they're supposed to be doing the reveal. So I'm sure we're going to find out in 2 to 3 weeks anyway. But at the same time, I mean, I've heard from multiple different sources, 2 different stories. Obviously, it's going to be 4, it's going to be 5. I mean, I'll not say where they've come from, but I've heard different people saying different things. So I haven't got a clue either. Nobody seems to actually really know what's going on. I was told one thing, I thought, okay, well, that'll be it. And then I was told one thing, and it's like, oh, is it going to be this? Like, nobody really seems to know. So, well, outside of the obvious people, but we'll find out in a few weeks. But I think it's definitely slowed people down. I think we may have seen things start to happen a little bit more often, a little bit more already. It's getting to that point where you want your team there so you can start playing together on old games. I mean, we've seen people playing Ghost, Black Ops 3, that sort of thing, just getting used to playing with each other again. People want the rosters locked in so they can practice as much as possible when the new game comes out, though. So I think teams would have moved by now, but I think this is definitely holding them back. Hopefully we do find out sooner rather than later. I don't know which direction it's going to go. It's hard to say, but yeah, definitely going to see teams making the moves as soon as everybody seems to know, I think.
Now, did you get a chance to play the Black Ops 4 beta a whole lot, or like a little bit here and there?
A decent amount.
A decent amount, yeah. So what were your thoughts whenever you were playing? I know it's obviously, like, it was a short period of time, right? It was a weekend, or 2 weekends, rather. After playing 5v5, what were your thoughts on it? Like, do you think it flew, or kind of it was fluent? Like, do you think it was a pretty decent idea to maybe change at least the public standpoint from 4v4 to 5v5? How did it feel for you? And do you think, based off of your game knowledge, at least for the most part, not a whole lot to really go off of, but do you think it could be a decent thing to venture on in the future?
I think it's hard to say based off publics. I've always sort of had that mindset of like, I don't really like to try and judge the game off playing publics on it too much. But in terms of 5v5. My issue would be is if we're playing certain game modes like Hardpoint, I think that it's going to start getting a little bit too fast. Like for me, I struggle to keep up with the kill feed sometimes with 4v4. So, and this is going to be a faster game, more players. I think it could become something that's it could be a little bit too much for me. I think the amount of interactions that are going on, for instance, Hardpoint is already a fairly hard game to follow occasionally, especially for viewers who are coming in from just playing Call of Duty in general. I think it's not necessarily the easiest game mode to follow, so I think that it will be hard for a game mode like that, hard for a game mode like CTF. S&D, I think it will be fine, because typically, it can be down to individual players, that sort of thing, and it's not necessarily as much of a factor. But I think I'd prefer to see it 4v4 stick that way. I understand why they would potentially want it to go 5v5 because that's what's being played on the public servers. That's it just makes it a little bit easier to sort of blur the lines a little bit. I understand it, but I think for competitive integrity standpoint, I think I'd prefer to see 4v4. However, as I said when I said before, I don't want to base it off what I played so far. I would have to wait until I actually got my hands on it and seeing how it's been played out to definitely confirm what I prefer. But by that point, we'll already know what's going to happen, because I don't think they're going to say, oh, it's 4v4 and then they'll change their minds, because it's such a big thing to change, isn't it? You can't just change things up. So we'll just see. We'll wait and see what happens. I could be talking rubbish. It might be completely different to what I envisage, but hope it stays 4v4. We'll see what happens though. I think as far as the game goes, I enjoyed it as well. I think 5v5 though, for competitive standpoint, maybe a little bit too much.
Well, you guys can obviously feel free to follow Tunn on Twitter at @CTunn_, or as well on twitch.tv/Tunny as well. Tunn, of course, thank you so much for joining me today, buddy.